Good day, Extreme Exhibitionists, I'm Unsilent, and not every game from the early days of PlayStation went on to be an icon. While time and nostalgia does funny things to memories, for every Rayman or Soul Calibur, there is the likes of today's subject to balance it out. Not every game can explode onto the scene with a bang, some saunter onto the scene with a big old meh. You may not remember because it's been exactly 30 years, but one of Sony's own efforts developed for the North American release of the PlayStation on September 9th, 1995, was deemed good for the time, but quickly forgotten and then disappointed fans and critics as new entries in the franchise were launched. Now, over 26 years after the last release, let's look back at one of the original titles and franchises for the PlayStation. It originally launched as ESPN Extreme Games, but you probably know it as the Xtreme series of games. It's a unique take on the world of action sports and racing combat in this episode of the RETROspective. Hello, and welcome to the RETROspective, a series in which I look back at the classic games that I've played. Normally when I look back at old games in this series, they're some of the best of all time, or at least generally well-regarded games in their genre. Today is not that. 2025 marks a milestone for a few things related to today's topic. First, this year marks the 30th anniversary of the PlayStation 1's release here in North America. Secondly, we just celebrated the 30th anniversary of ESPN's Extreme Games, which has continued as the X Games. And where we arrive at the topic of this video, it's also the 30th anniversary of the Xtreme franchise of PlayStation games. But as a quick refresher, the PlayStation 1 launched in North America on September 9th, 1995. Now, you'll probably say, but Unsilent, Sony marked the 30th anniversary of the PS1 last year. And that's true from a certain point of view. Okay, it's actually true because the PS1 hit store shelves in Japan on December 3rd, 1994, some 9 months before reaching here. Like any hardware launch, you needed games to play for the console to actually be usable. While Sony was hard at work launching their first foray into the home video game console market, in a small town in New England, USA, an idea was being formed that would bring the rebellious undercurrent of 1990s counterculture to the fore. As far back as 1993, ESPN was looking for ways of tapping into what was cool with kids of that day. They launched ESPN2 as the edgier younger sibling to the ESPN mothership. It tried to tap into the popularity of the MTV crowd in that way that only big corporate could. They used the number 2 in show titles wherever they could. They tried for a more casual style of presentation. They used lowercase letters whenever they could, and they featured youthful talents like Keith Olbermann. Yeah, kids were really tuning in for Olbermann's takes on Supercross.
Good evening and welcome to the end of our careers.
Part of their courting of counterculture was developing their own major international sporting event featuring action sports. Unveiled in 1994 and launching in 1995, ESPN brought the world the ESPN Extreme Games, a week-long festival of the extreme that quickly became the Olympics of action sports. Featuring 9 different sports, the Extreme Games became a smash hit for fans of action sports and members of those communities. Unlike ESPN2's attempt to tap into youth counterculture, this actually worked. The Extreme Games were so popular that ESPN took what was supposed to be a biennial event and turned it into an annual event. It's still going today as the X Games, with expansions that included the Winter X Games and international events. Oh yes, and it also spawned a video game. It wouldn't be the 90s if something on TV or in the movie theater didn't get a licensed video game. After all, ESPN Extreme Games wasn't just competing for eyeballs on TV, but for your video game dollars against such luminaries as Three Ninjas Kick Back, Waterworld, and Tintin in Tibet. Maybe it's just anecdotal, but it doesn't feel like licensed games based on TV shows or movies are as common today as they were 20 or 30 years ago. Sure, that means we missed out on some games like the aforementioned Walmart bargain bin shovelware, but that also means we miss out on games that could be on the level of the likes of GoldenEye, Spider-Man 2, or Return of the King on the opposite end of the spectrum. There was a time, when video game development costs hadn't spiraled out of control with nothing to show for it except slightly prettier graphics than the last generation, where it was almost more common for a kid or teen-friendly media property to have a licensed video game spin-off than for it to not have one. If I look at the PS1 game collection, of the 20 or so non-sports games on my shelf, about a quarter of them are based on TV shows or movies. Anyway, ESPN Extreme Games fit on PlayStation. Sony's entry into video games was aimed at the older than the still family-friendly and mascot-heavy focus of Nintendo. If people who were into the action at the Extreme Games were playing video games, they were probably going to lean towards a PS1. The likes of Tomb Raider, Twisted Metal, and a launch title like Soul Calibur were going to be right up their alley. With the Extreme Games license, you would have come into this expecting a game that resembles the real thing in some meaningful way. Making its way from the actual Extreme Games were mountain bikes, skateboards, inline skates, and street luges. Sadly, the likes of bungee jumping, rock climbing, sky surfing, and water skiing did not make the transition from ESPN to PS1. However, also not making its way from ESPN to the PS1 is very much gameplay that resembles what you'd expect from an X Games themed game. The original iteration of the X Games had events like Street Luge and inline skating races along with downhill mountain bike races. Those were the closest equivalents to real-world action that would make its way to the video game. The skateboarding and inline street and vert competitions? Nothing even close in this game. You'd have to wait 4 years for Tony Hawk's Pro Skater to get a feel for that action. What it does resemble is the popular game Road Rash. Originally a Sega Genesis game, Electronic Arts kept it going through the 1990s, and the gameplay does bear considerable resemblance to Extreme Games. It's also a point-to-point racing game against a number of opponents, 14 instead of Extreme Games 15. Players can race their way to the front through speed or pummeling their opposition. Both games can see you or your opponents thrown from their mounts by crashing into a solid object or by having their stamina meters depleted through fighting. After the race, you can purchase faster equipment using money earned in race. Really, aside from Road Rash solely being on motorcycles and Extreme Games' inclusion of a championship, they're effectively the same game. Road Rash is a fondly remembered game now and was critically acclaimed at the time, so I could understand why a developer would want to make a Road Rash-inspired game. Extreme Games is like Road Rash, but with an emphasis on the rash. Trying to emulate Road Rash resulted in a racing game with extreme sports equipment rather than an extreme sports game. 16 competitors race on a point-to-point track seeking to pass through gates and defeat other racers by any means necessary. Pummeling other racers is probably the height of entertainment in this game, and the one mechanic in here that seemed to work best. Passing through gates earns you either season championship points or money. How does any of this resemble the actual Extreme Games? It's been 30 years, and we're still trying to figure that one out. In this sense, it reminds me of why licensed games tend to struggle. They don't often resemble the real product they're trying to recreate virtually. Road Rash was a unique intellectual property, so it could exist as its own thing. An Extreme Games tie-in game is supposed to resemble the action of the actual property it's recreating. It's one thing to take a little creative license in making a video game, but this was more than a little creative license. The game's core mechanic seems to be a stamina meter at the top of the screen. You deplete stamina as you accelerate or get hit. Sounds straightforward enough. However, all of this franchise's games have a weird mechanic where at a certain point, if you just coast along, you still gain speed and reach your top speed, which wouldn't happen if you kept trying to accelerate. Once you wrap your head around that mechanic, the game gets easier. Not easy, just easier. Collision detection is hit and miss, pun intended. Sometimes running into a trackside object will bring you to a complete stop, or knock you flat on your arse, or just let you keep going. Even at a full stamina meter, you don't quite know what the outcome of hitting an object will be. The one consistent piece of collision detection is that if someone lands on your head, you're going down. One neat mechanic is that you can pick any of the game's 4 modes of transit to race on at any time. Each character that you can select has their specialty, but just because you're racing as a skateboarder doesn't mean that you can't use a street luge. You just won't be as fast as you would be on a skateboard. That handy AI is so much faster on a street luge than you are, but you get my point. It's also why the kick button is your go-to. Few things in this game are as satisfying as kicking a loser off his luge. And I can't go any farther without mentioning that this game is hard. Soul-crushingly hard at times. Even with the best equipment for your racer, good fortune more than skill will be what's actually needed to win a race. You want to win the season championship? Because each season starts you with the worst equipment, speed to get to the front of the field is lacking until you can upgrade. Even though each race starts with a standing start, the AI quickly streaks away from you. While it takes you a while to catch up, one mistake will drop you to the back of the field. And this is just how hard the game is in easy mode. It's like they tried making an arcade game to eat all your quarters. I will say that visually, the game looks okay. Being released at the very beginning of the PS1's lifecycle, it doesn't push the limits of the technology. Instead, it features a lot of 2D sprite work and environmental backgrounds with a smattering of 3D objects as you race down a 3D course. It's a classic approach to racing games dating to the oldest of the home consoles. While some games were using the PS1's hardware to make fully 3D games, Sony's first-party development team wasn't ready to push the technology that far. Where you do get a tie-in with the actual Xtreme games is in some full-motion video clips of actual Xtreme Games host Susie Colbert. I believe I'm obliged to mention her Monday Night Football encounter with the drunken Joe Namath here. Anyway, she pops up before each race to introduce the location, and then afterwards to berate you when you don't win. So if you have a humiliation fetish, this game is perfect for you.
Some people would be embarrassed by a run like that. You probably won a freaking trophy. A little advice for next time, try finishing ahead of the other racers. Let me tell you something, that tortoise and the hare thing doesn't work around here. If you were going any slower, you'd be going backwards. I'm really glad we all wasted our time and came out here and watched you race like that. I hope your family wasn't watching. Last, absolutely, positively, the last person to finish the race. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Don't think so, scrub. Wow, that season was so bad it was almost painful to watch. Well, maybe it wasn't that bad, but you are definitely lacking in some skills. You need practice in the worst way.
On the whole, while ESPN Extreme Games had some promising moments and potential for the future, some work was needed to make this anything more than average. It's kind of like the actual Extreme Games in that regard. There were some good ideas buried in there, but some more time, money, and polish was required to take that next step. Now, despite my and some critics' misgivings about Extreme Games, it was reported to be the best-selling first-party game in the PlayStation 1's first year of existence. Some 18 months after the launch of the PS1, Sony introduced their Greatest Hits program to re-release popular games at a lower price point. As one of the top-selling PS1 launch games, ESPN Extreme Games was included in that program, so it got renewed life. It may not have been a critical darling, but it was a commercial hit. But before it could join the Greatest Hits lineup, Extreme Games gave birth to a sequel. Sometime after the release of ESPN Extreme Games in 1995, the licensing agreement between Sony and ESPN expired and wasn't renewed. As such, plans for making a sequel to Extreme Games were slightly waylaid. Not in that Sony decided they weren't making a sequel, that was going to happen. But without the ESPN and Extreme Games branding, at this point it hadn't been rechristened as the X Games, Sony needed a new name. While the official story around the rebranding seems to have been lost to time, it looks like Sony wanted to connect the sequel with ESPN Extreme Games and the actual X Games with the new name. So the word Extreme stayed in the game title, but stylized with just an X for Extreme. Then they added a number 2 to show it was a sequel, but putting it at the beginning to make it punny, as in 2 Extreme. You know, 2 as in TOO? Anyway, as you've probably gathered by the footage of this game, it's very similar to the original Extreme Games. It's still point-to-point races in which you try to accumulate points by finishing high up the order and going through gates in order to win the season-long championship. However, a lot of good changes were made along the way. First, the equipment mechanic was done away with. This was replaced by a robust character building system and tying each different method of transport to a particular race venue, which forces you to build or select a well-rounded character. Oh yes, and that's another change. You can create your own character and set their attributes if you don't like selecting one of the characters already in the game. And before we get into the gameplay changes, I should mention that this game actually lets you save games using the memory card instead of Extreme Games' password system. Once in a race, the biggest change is the inclusion of power-ups. There are 4 new power-ups to give you an in-race boost. There's the Invincibility power-up, the Strength power-up to help you with knocking down the opposition, the Jumping power-up, which is self-explanatory, and the Speed power-up for speed bursts. All of these have to be balanced against dealing with the opposition, even more trackside objects, and now moving animals and pedestrians that can cross your path too. There are a few other new tricks to the game as well. For example, tricks. Yes, through a face button combo, you can do tricks to earn season points. Season points can also be earned by going through gates, knocking down the opposition, and finishing position. Because of that, I found winning a championship to be a lot more doable than in the first game. Even winning a race was easier because you're not beholden to having the best in-game equipment to be fast, since it's just character attributes that determine speed in a particular discipline. While 2 Xtreme wasn't a massive step forward over Extreme Games, it was certainly an improvement. Even if there were fewer locations and racers than the first game in the series, the game looked better and played better in every aspect than the game that came before it. And without being bogged down by the ESPN license, 2 Xtreme just became its own thing without having to be compared to ESPN's TV product that the original game was nothing like. So with the game being an improvement over its predecessor, why did the franchise not catch on? The original Extreme Games did have the advantage of releasing with the launch of the PS1 and with a smash hit real-world license attached, so it was set up to commercially thrive. Without the license, and with a weird name, 2 Xtreme had more of an uphill climb. On top of that, 2 Xtreme's similarity to Extreme Games was a blessing and curse. Blessing in that it gave 989 Studios a quick game that they could bang out in the midst of the plethora of games that they were producing as one of Sony's few in-house development teams. A curse because the industry had already pushed past 2 Xtreme's style of game and entered the fully 3D space. Even in the PS1's first month, the likes of Ridge Racer and Wipeout surpassed the quality of Extreme Games. That gap was widening as the likes of Cool Borders, Demolition Derby, Twisted Metal, and even 989's own Jet Moto clearing the bar for action sports and racing games that 2 Xtreme set. After 2 entries, it wasn't looking good for Sony's Extreme Games. By the way, if we're going through the franchise chronologically, we may want to come back to ESPN's Extreme Games right now. Remember that Greatest Hits re-release I mentioned earlier? Well, without the ESPN licensing, it needed a new game if Sony was going to put new copies on store shelves. Fortunately, they inadvertently stumbled upon a naming scheme with 2 Xtreme. So if the sequel is 2 Xtreme, and 2 is a number, then clearly the predecessor must be 1 Xtreme. In a bubble, it's a ridiculous name. 1 Xtreme only works as a name knowing that there was a 2 Xtreme that followed. Maybe just Xtreme would have worked as a game title, but we'll never know now. But other than the new name, the new logo, and removing ESPN branding and excising Susie Colbert clips from the game, it was ESPN Extreme Games with... I can't even say a new coat of paint. It was ESPN Extreme Games with a new bumper sticker slapped on it. With the release of the Greatest Hits version of 1 Xtreme in 1998, we should have seen it as a sign that another entry in the franchise was coming. Indeed, it came out the next year with 1999's 3 Xtreme. In the 3 years following the release of 2 Xtreme, 989 Studios worked to give 3 Xtreme a double meaning to its name. First, and obviously it was the third entry in the franchise, now using the naming structure set by its 2 predecessors. Secondly, 3 Xtreme made the jump to the third dimension. Now 4 years after the launch of the PS1 and the Xtreme franchise, 989 Studios wasn't just going to make a third sprite-based game, but rather go fully 3D like 3 Xtreme's contemporaries. So while the core concept of the game remains the same, what resulted was a different-looking experience. Other than the backgrounds and skyboxes, all of the in-game assets were 3D objects. The problem is that the sprites of the previous games looked better than the fully 3D objects of this game. It reminds you a lot of the early days of 3D movies and games. Technically, a good idea. In reality, God no. Character models suffer the worst with awkward shapes, low-quality textures, and poor animations. And to add insult to injury, the game runs at an unsteady 25 frames per second compared to the 30 frames per second of the first 2 games, despite cutting down the number of racers in each event to 6, down from 16 and 10 in the previous 2 games. Yes, this looks like the early days of 3D gaming, but 1999 is long past the early days of 3D. The result is a game that feels slow with lethargic controls and empty levels. Even with fewer racers to render than previous entries, it feels like the PS1 was overtaxed by this new approach. Levels just feel like canyons you race down with no active world around you to race through. Because the levels are empty and the frame rate low, the sense of speed disappears. For better or worse, 3 Xtreme tries to cherry-pick gameplay concepts from the other 2 games in order to build what 989 was hoping would be the ultimate Xtreme experience. The equipment feature returned in a sense. Each character would get their specialty of skateboard, inline skate, or bikes. Luges and snowboards were removed from the game, and you can't select which mode of transport to use. To upgrade equipment, you needed points. Not season points, those are now awarded solely based on race finishes. No, points from going through gates and doing tricks now act as currency to spend on better equipment for your racer. Similar to 2 Xtreme, the difficulty has come down from 1 Xtreme. You have a sort of career path that increases in difficulty as you go along. The first career mode available is on the easiest difficulty in terms of the opposing racers and the difficulty of the actual tracks. Winning a championship advances you to the next difficulty level. From there, the difficulty ramps up, but you also get some new locations added to the mix. Like the previous 2 games, the same locations will reappear with slightly altered tracks, just usually in terms of rails and ramps for tricks. What else sets 3 Xtreme apart is the addition of 2 new game modes. With the added emphasis on tricks, 989 added a trick-focused game mode called Freestyle. This gives you about 1 minute to do tricks and rack up points. There's also a time trial mode, in which you race from end to end of a course as fast as possible while also trying to pass through all of the gates placed on a track. Are there any benefits to this? No, not really. Just a leaderboard. Is anyone else here old enough to remember Cool Borders 2? Aside from me, of course. In Cool Borders 2, that game's main single-player mode had a neat little qualification round before each race. Your score in a trick competition determined your starting position and starting time deficit to the pole sitter. It's not like this was a secret to 989. Sony published Cool Borders, and 989 took over the franchise after the second entry. With 3 Xtreme's 3 different game modes, race, freestyle, and time trial, there was an opportunity to mix things up in the season mode and use those game modes in a constructive way instead of being a superfluous add-in. Also new for 3 Xtreme, unlockable characters. They aren't standard characters, but rather fictional characters, if you take my meaning. They are characters inspired by the realms of horror, sci-fi, and the Italian Job? I'm not sure how else to describe the old mini knockoff almost RC cars that round out the unlockable roster. They don't even do tricks like the opposition, it's just a little tilt to the side which just looks comical. You've already added extraterrestrials, why not go full Transformers with the tricks? Dominique, the game's take on the Bride of Frankenstein, is only slightly less out of place. At least TP the Mummy works as a Beavis and Butthead reference. That's tapping into youth culture. There's also an extra freestyle-only track that you unlock after winning the season mode in pro difficulty, but since it's only a freestyle mode map, I'll understand if you might have missed this if you played the game. The problem I have with 3 Extreme isn't that there aren't steps in the right direction. The move to 3D, the progressive difficulty, and adding game modes are all positive steps for the franchise. It's just that the execution was lacking. The 3D world resulted in a sacrifice of performance. The progressive difficulty is nice in that the game is no longer cripplingly difficult, but this only opens up 2 new maps. Granted, track count has never been the series' strength, but it would have been nice if they put some effort into it. And the extra game modes are so extra that they're essentially superfluous. These all needed to be added at some point for the franchise to take the next step, but none landed as well as they could have or needed to in order to make this franchise relevant for the first time since it lost its ESPN license. 989 threw more at us with 3 Extreme, but they forgot to add the fun. And what became of the Extreme series after 3 Extreme? Well, much like the reporting and documentation of 1 through 3 Extreme, not much is known. However, a 4 Extreme was never released, and I can't find any indication that it was particularly far into development, if it ever existed aside from some basic pre-production work. Here we are 30 years after the original game was released, and some quarter century after the last entry in the franchise saw the light of day, and no one has been clamoring for a revival, so I wouldn't hold out much hope for it. By the time 3 Extreme was released, 989 Studios was primarily a sports development studio. They did the occasional shooter, including Siphon Filter 2, which was their last non-sports game in 2000, but it was primarily focused on licensed and unlicensed sports games. Its legacy continues today, as early members of 989 formed Red Zone Interactive, which later became Sony San Diego Studio, which is still going today as the developer of MLB The Show. Of course, during this era of the Extreme, 989 was doing a little bit of everything. As one of Sony's signature first-party development studios, it was developing or assisting with at least half a dozen games annually prior to the launch of the PlayStation 2, peaking with 16 games released in 1999. As for the Extreme games, that's still going today, though ESPN did sell off the property recently. Despite the miss that was 1995's effort, the X Games even made a brief return to the video game realm. ESPN struck up a new licensing deal with Konami in the early 2000s that resulted in the release of ESPN X Games Skateboarding and ESPN Winter X Games Snowboarding. Konami's snowboarding games were reasonably well received. Skateboarding, on the other hand, was dead on arrival. 4 months after the release of 3 Extreme, the definitive Extreme Sports video game franchise launched. In September 1999, Activision published Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. I just did an extensive deep dive into that franchise's career mode in a video you can find linked at the top right and in the description. But Pro Skater popularized the genre of extreme sports video games. Activision went all in with a series of Pro Extreme Sports game franchise attempts. Electronic Arts launched their own imprint of EA Sports Big for its snowboarding games and arcade sports games. The promise of an X Games-inspired video game was eventually fulfilled. It just took a few years and a more tightly focused game to make that splash. Usually, I don't find it too difficult to conjure up words about the latest game or games that I do a deep dive into. The problem is that the Extreme series of games is just so middling that it's hard to feel inspired to come up with any words to describe them. Hell, talking about the actual X Games or the Road Rash games that were used for inspiration was easier to do than write about 1 through 3 Extreme. There are good ideas to be pulled from each of the games in the franchise, and maybe a 4 Extreme would have pulled it all together into a satisfying whole. The multiple game modes of 3 Extreme, paired with the character building of 2 Extreme, and the drive to make something real-world inspired like ESPN Extreme Games, could have all come together to make a solid overall experience. Instead, you get games that are 2 steps forward, 1 step back at best as we progress through the franchise. However, even if there was a 4 Xtreme, there would have been one massive issue that it never would have been able to overcome. There was no way it was going to be better than Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Extreme sports were mainstream in 1999 when the final entry in the franchise hit store shelves, but the game didn't capitalize and was left well in the dust. It's not even a case of Xtreme had to walk so Tony Hawk could run. No, Tony Hawk was throwing down 900s in gaming while 3 Xtreme was faceplanting. There's a reason why this franchise has been lost to time for the last quarter century. In doing research for this video, there wasn't a lot of behind-the-scenes information that I could gather for these games. I'm not sure if it was lost to time or just never really recorded anywhere at the time. However, behind-the-scenes footage or interview footage and magazine articles other than reviews were in short supply. For other games that I do these long-form videos on, while history on the games may be in short supply, there's usually some information that has survived to this day. Clearly, nobody cared enough about the Xtreme franchise to preserve its history. I can understand why, though. These games can be summarized as mid at best and poor at worst. Even the best game in the franchise, 2 Xtreme, was pretty short and lacking in replay value. At least 1 Xtreme had the obscene difficulty to conquer, and 3 Xtreme had a variety of tracks, game modes, and unlockables to play through. 2 Xtreme, while cromulent and competent, lacked that next step that would have made it iconic with PlayStation gamers. And that will do it for this look back at Sony and 989's Xtreme franchise. Do you have any memories of playing ESPN Extreme Games or the more X's for Xtreme 1 through 3 Xtreme games? If so, leave them in the comments down below. And on your way there, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe if you're new or looking for more looks back at retro gaming greatness, share on social media, follow on social media. The social media handle is Unsilent on Air for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and more. And don't forget, there's plenty more deep dives into the classic and not so classic of video games in the playlists there on the screen, in the description down below, and more videos anytime on the channel page. And until the next time, I'm Unsilent. Thanks very much for joining me. Like, share, subscribe, and we will see you next time.